Hello, this is Pastor Scott Conway at Quest Xian, the how-to, real answers, explain it all. Maybe it doesn't mean what they say. God-trusting, Bible-believing, saved by Jesus church. And of course, we've been talking about a bump, we've been talking about divorce, we've been talking about sex, and we will also be talking about men. For this particular chat, I'm going to combine divorce and sex because we've talked about both of those so far, but get a part of how they combine, because as a lawyer and as a pastor, so someone who's handled probably some 300 cases of legal divorce, and as a counselor who's handled, I don't even know, I couldn't guess how many times I've had divorce be a counseling issue over the 30 some odd years. And now I will say this though, with stunning consistency, and this might be a surprise to people, is that when counseling into a dissolving marriage is how often the marriage dissolves. Of course, you would expect that very often with marriage and family therapists, what they find is that most of the time a newly divorcing individual from a couple comes in for counseling, they still end up getting divorced, and the effective job of the counselor ends up being counseling someone through the divorce. But also with some consistency, we're able to resolve the issues, create more insight, create more understanding, kind of create some ahas that can then lead to some changed behavior, changed understandings, changed insights, changed deals that allow the marriage to continue. Now, of course, I can't say that the marriages continue indefinitely for some of the couples that I've counseled before, but in many cases, several years after the fact, they're still married and reasonably happily so. At least, probably at least as happy as they likely would have been had they gotten divorced. Because there's, several keys in there, one of which is don't get divorced when you're intensely emotional. Wait until you settle down from the emotion, be able to hash out the issues, be able to work out what is actually at stake here, what are the issues. And one couple in particular, they wanted my help on the legal side and also some counseling. Okay, first we just have to get through our daughter's wedding. And how can we go to our daughter's wedding and just pretend that everything's okay? Well, I told them, well, don't pretend everything's okay. Just can you make your daughter's wedding be about your daughter and her wedding, and not make your daughter's wedding about your problems? So do you love your daughter? Yes. Do you love your daughter? Yes. Okay. So just ignore the fact the two of you are having problems. We will deal with the problems between the two of you some other time. Right now, you just love your daughter. You just love your daughter. Let your daughter's wedding be about your daughter getting married. And then we will address your issues later. Well, all it really took was that shift in focus, focusing on what they had in common. They had their daughter in common. They had their daughter's wedding in common. Of course, it's a wedding. It's about love. And it helped them put their current problem in perspective. And when they had the current problem in perspective, just the perspective was enough for them to realize, you know what? We're having this fight that is way outside from the actual issue. So how about, rather than fight, we'll just set aside the issue, give the emotion some time to settle down, and then we'll do something about the problem. And it totally worked for them. And that was, some number of years ago. Because they were in my office. I haven't had that office for a long time, but I remember where I was sitting having the conversation when they said, you know what? We're actually doing okay. And I saw them kind of online in social media recently, and they're still married and chugging along just fine. So just because someone is at that breaking point in a marriage doesn't necessarily mean that it's got to end. Just because you're having some jugular issue conflict doesn't mean it has to end. Now, it may, because of course hundreds of times I've been a part of the marriage actually ending. But one of the things I want to look at when we're talking about sex and marriage is the fact that I don't know, I might guess 4 out of 5 times, the issue is sex and or money. Now, the sex issues, as we've been talking about sex from a more sexual relationship, physical side, is often an intimacy issue. And the intimacy issues often go beyond just the, do you choose to engage in this physical activity? Money is more commonly a priority issue, because money is math. I mean, there's no reason to fight over math. You have X number of dollars coming in, you have X number of dollars that need to go out, and then you have Y number of dollars left over, or you're going Y number of dollars in the debt, depending upon whether Y is a positive number or a negative number. Where the money fights typically happen is, how do we apply the Y? That when we've got the income, we've fulfilled our basic minimum responsibilities, what do we do with our available discretionary money? And so if you understand that you're not fighting about money, you're fighting about priorities, then instead of having a fight triggered by money, you can have a collaborative, creative discussion to talk about and seek to resolve your financial issues at a priority level. What's the priorities we will choose collaboratively? How will we do the cleave? There's my priorities, there's your priorities, and what will we craft together collaboratively to be our priorities? Now, one of the things I talked about is the idea we're going to talk about sex and divorce. Okay, well, sex and divorce. So, 6-7 minutes into this, the other big thing, of course, is sex. Well, one of the things you'll hear me talk about sometimes is that when you're dealing with sexual relationships, variety tends to be one of the keys. So frequency, variety, the sort of things that you do, how often you do it, and how mutual it is. Sometimes it's indulgent to him, sometimes it's indulgent to her. So a sexual relationship, a physical pleasure relationship, ought to be sometimes a gift from him to her, sometimes a gift from her to him, and often a shared experience, a mutual pleasure. And that the gift and the sharing can all occur in a single occurrence, or the gift to gift and the shared pleasure can be different times. So there was one couple that actually made a deal. And the deal for this physical touch woman, who wanted physical touch as one of her primary love languages, was cuddles. And the simple deal they made was unlimited cuddles for unlimited quickies. Now, her biggest hesitation on making this deal wasn't that she was opposed to quickies. It was that she didn't want their relationship, their sexual relationship, to turn into just that. So this is a physical touch woman. So she likes the cuddles, and the quickies are fun for her from time to time. But she doesn't want their entire physical relationship to be cuddles and quickies. So as part of the deal, it was that at least once a month she gets what they called gourmet lovemaking. Now in their case, that was like a staycation, and that they would invest in a much larger sensual experience where the erection in vagina was just one part of the totality of the experience. But it was a love-making gourmet time. And then at least once a week, she got a what I think they refer to as like a good, healthy meal. Meaning that it might not be the kind of gourmet stretched out over an hour or 2 or 3. That's going to be at least once a month. But in the weeks they're not doing the gourmet, she was entitled, as part of this deal, that he would actively invest in making sure that she experienced the things that she liked to experience. And then also, as part of the deal, is he had unlimited access to the quickie. And for them, that worked really, really well. Now, when you have both a husband and a wife who can agree to something like that, and that they conclude together collaboratively that works for them, something like that can be great. Now, what if you have a woman who's not physical touch? What if you have a woman for whom that sort of thing would be a sacrifice for her, that she would be surrendering to something she doesn't like, she doesn't want to do it, but she feels like she's stuck, she has to. And what she would like isn't cuddles. She would like something else. Well, that deal might not work. In fact, I would go as far as to say that deal would not work. So deals are very, very specific to the individuals. Deals are very, very intimate. Intimacy, into me, see. But it has to do with who he is. It has to do with who she is. And so when you're building this kind of physical intimacy, we begin to see how important the tastes and the desires and the individual values and the individual desires and what's fun and exciting and what builds and manifests intimacy between two individuals will vary from couple to couple. And that's the physical version, the sexual version of what we call there is no space. There is no space. So if I'm having sex with my wife, there is no physical space between us. I mean, I am literally inside of her. And when you're dealing with that concept, using sex as a metaphor, that idea that there is no space, then you take that to other things like finances, like other aspects of the day-to-day life. Is where can you come together collaboratively? What can you build together as a unit? Where can you cleave? Where there's our way that is built out of the my way and the your way. What can we make together? And if we look at the totality of the wonders of the sexual relationship as a metaphor for other aspects, that can sometimes be very, very useful. Because when we think about what we're exploring sexually, generally speaking, you have certain things. One side tends to like variety, the other side tends to like intimacy. We talk about sex should be the embodiment of and the manifestation of intimacy. That there should be a connection of the naked souls that precedes the connection of the naked bodies. Now, can you just have sex because you're married and you decide to have sex? Sort of the sexual aspect of a relationship is kind of one of the fundamentals of the difference between being married and not being married. So if I have a sister and I'm living with my sister and maybe I'm helping her raise her kids, and we have a very close brother-sister relationship, or if I have the same situation with a female roommate, there's a lot of things we can do together. We can keep a house together. We can divide up the chores. We can divide up the bills. We can both spend time with the children. There's all of these things that can be a totally legitimate part of that relationship and would be a healthy manifestation of a close brother-sister relationship. There would be a healthy manifestation of a very close roommate relationship. But you shouldn't be having sex. And so you begin to see with that kind of idea that the sexual aspect of a relationship is kind of somewhat fundamental to the difference between an intimate marital relationship and a very close not marital relationship. So when we start to look at things like that, we go, okay, so where else can we use that metaphor? Where else can we have this level of connection, this level of intimacy, where we're manifesting the exact same principles, but we're doing the principles on a different subject? And part of it begins when we have this idea of a swim. I am waiting for a swim. A swim stands for ASWIM, awesome sex when I'm married. Now, I'm not necessarily telling everyone, well, if you're not married, you shouldn't be having sex. I think most of us could probably conclude, like, well, if we lived in an ideal world and if we did everything perfectly, okay. And even couples who are living together, not married, and are having sex together, not married, would say, well, yeah, if that's the way a couple did it and that totally worked for them, that might be better. And so that's, rather than an edict that I'm going to be all judgmental and commanding and I'm going to be prescriptive and tell you how you ought to live your life, generally speaking, I think we can agree that if you're going to engage in the activity that tends to make babies, that the sequence of get connected and be committed before you make a baby is a good sequence, is a healthy sequence, is something that you would want for your child. Well, without making that the topic of today's talk, let's take a look at some of this intimacy thing, because the sex, the way I teach it, should be the embodiment of the intimacy. And so the physical, there is no space, should be preceded by a soul level, there is no space. Now note that there is no space doesn't mean that there's a sameness, because when you're having sex, his body and her body are each other's bodies. You don't literally become one physical body. You have the him and the her coming together to a them in a powerful, intimate, mutually pleasurable way. You're creating this experience together. And when you look at kind of the naked soul thing as the same thing, as there's my will, mind, and emotions, and there's her will, mind, and emotions. And we have those intimate points of connection where we're creating this kind of joint couple level will, mind, and emotion. That there might be me as an individual and her as an individual, but together we're creating this couple level of how the couple makes decisions, how the couple looks at things, what the couple learns, what the team does, how the team makes decisions, which can include like parenting decisions and vacation decisions, how we do this jointly together as a team, and how we feel about certain things. And there'll be that individuality, but there's also this connection where there's this jointness to it that blends the me and the you to make a we. And when we begin to look at the soul level, we begin to look at that at the spiritual level of religion, principles, and others. We look at that at the heart level. And we're looking for that same idea of there is no space. And just like awesome sex when I'm married is a coming together in that committed relationship to manifest and embody that intimacy, how do we build that intimacy to begin with? How do we build it physically? I mean, that's the sexual part, but then also how do we build that financially? And we talked about, there's the basics of money, which is do the responsibilities, how much money do you have left over? It's math. There's, X plus Y is your total income, X is your expenses, and Y is a positive number or a negative number, and that part's all math. And then you have the priority question. Then you have the things you're going to decide upon together as a couple. And when you do that, rather than fight about it, you can create the same kind of powerful intimacy that a close sexual relationship can. And just like romance is about creating that emotional connection, and then when a romantic evening then manifests in a sexual time, you are embodying the connection of the date. You're embodying the connection of your affection time. Rather than having the affection time be about getting to this goal at the end, it becomes the same thing with your finances. That it's not about get to the goal at the end. You fulfill the responsibilities because they're yours to fulfill. Doesn't matter how you feel about them, those you just do. But then you come down to how are we together jointly going to prioritize things? And the same thing happens physically, the same thing happens financially, the same thing happens in soul and spirit. And so when we're looking at there is no space, it doesn't mean there is no individuality. It means there's no place where we intentionally and willfully disconnect from one another. And using sex as a metaphor there, if you're in the middle of something and you call someone by the wrong name, you're in the middle of something and suddenly you just start talking about some random thing, or you engage in behaviors that are hurtful and painful to the other person. It would be obvious in a sexual situation, you don't do that. Not if you want the situation to continue to be this powerful, intimate manifestation, because then it gets exploitive, abusive. Well, we wouldn't want to do that sexually. We also don't want to do that financially. We also don't want to do that in matters of the soul, will, mind, and emotions, or matters of the spirit, religion, principles, others, or matter of the heart, the preconscious, the subconscious, the deep dark. And so we're looking for these points of connection and to cultivate the points of connection. We're looking for those points of intimacy, to build and cultivate the points of intimacy. Now think about if you do this. Think about some of the most powerful romantic times. Think about weddings and honeymoons. Think about anniversaries and Valentine's Day. Whatever, some of the most powerful, intimate, romantic, love-based connections that also manifested sexually, but where the sex that came was a manifestation of, rather than racing ahead of, for the couple. And consider, how did all of that happen when it comes to affection and romance, matters of the heart and the body? Think, okay, so using that as a metaphor, how do we do that in other areas of our lives? And if we can truly see to each other's sexual fulfillment, not just some minimum obligation, like, okay, fine, if that's really important to you, fine. Where, imagine we have date nights. So why do we have to do these stupid date nights? Fine, I committed to a date night. I'll take you to your dumb movie and we'll go out to a stupid dinner. Well, the date night might not be quite as much fun if one, the other, or both people have that kind of attitude. And obviously it's the same thing with sex. Okay, fine, if you want to do your stupid thing, if you can't control your animalistic, primitive urges, fine, go ahead. Well, that's probably not what somebody's interested in. That's probably not what somebody's looking for. So why would that be different with the other important intimacies in life? It probably wouldn't. All principles must be consistently applied, which just means that whenever the same principles are rightly in operation, the same principles ought to rightly be used. And when we're talking about sex and money, when we're talking about material things and immaterial things, when we're talking about issues of the soul, issues of the spirit, issues of the heart, we're looking at the same manifestation of principles. And so when you look at the sexual relationship as a metaphor, and you look at ideals like that as a metaphorical ideal, not just a affection and romance being the umbrella, creating the environment in which the embodiment of that love and the embodiment of that connection, the embodiment of that intimacy manifests physically in a sexual connection, in the periodic gourmet love connection. And that's part of the awesome sex when I'm married, is realize awesome doesn't mean it's gourmet every single time. It just means there's gourmet in it. And that when we do that, and we apply that principle consistently in our lives, we can build a marital relationship. We can build an intimate relationship. And when we have that kind of intimate relationship, that intimate connection, we don't have to worry about a change in status. At least not nearly as often. It would take some manifested values, principles, priorities, some circumstances that would have to be pretty compelling to be able to break a really good relationship if both the man and the woman, and both the husband and the wife, maintain that philosophy of intimacy, that philosophy of creating the desire to connect, creating that steady fill in from the very beginning to the end kind of embodiment of deep connection. And that if we do that, chances are pretty high we're not going to tear the relationship asunder, because one of the things we say sometimes is divorce is the legal manifestation of a relationship long since torn asunder. And if we guard the relationship well, if we guard the intimacy well, if we create deals that are fulfilling enough mutually, if we create a connection, we create agreements with one another for how we will show up for one another, how we will show up as a couple. If we cleave on purpose. then the having and the holding becomes a manifestation, a principle that we use in many other places in our life and in our world. And then you have deal keeping. And we talked about for-cause divorce is a basic manifestation of broken deals. And that when the vows are broken, when new deals cannot be renegotiated to be balanced and healthy, it might be time to change the label we attach to the relationship, because the relationship is no longer worthy of the label we currently have. And we do that in almost every area of life. So this idea of ASWIM, awesome sex when I'm married, and we take that with the upgrade principle, and the upgrade principle just means the more elevated the status, the better the deal ought to be. That means that the married deal ought to be a better deal, both a better deal offered and a better deal received, than the not married deal. Otherwise, why get married if getting married is not going to be better in some way? And then likewise, moving from courting to engaged ought to be an upgrade in the deal. Moving from dating to courting ought to be an upgrade in the deal. Moving from just going on dates to being involved in an exclusive dating relationship ought to be an upgrade in the deal. That spending time together ought to be a plus, not a minus. And that's the upgrade principle, that the upgraded status of the relationship ought to be a plus, not a minus. Getting married isn't permission to stop showing up well for the other person. Getting married is a promise to continue to show up well at a higher level of commitment, at a higher level of engagement, at a higher level of intimacy. And so while we're building our lives, that awesome sex when I'm married part becomes then the metaphor we use to understand our goal with the other aspects of life. Upgrading our physical relationship, upgrading our financial relationship, upgrading our commitment. It's all about the upgrade, the upgrade, the upgrade. And when we begin to look at the totality of the relationship and we see that awesome sex when I'm married thing means that this old thing, I would like to think it's not still true, but unfortunately, statistically, it might be, is that the frequency of sex in the first year or two of marriage, and if you skip forward past the 5-year mark, you see, and how frequently is a couple continuing to engage in a sexual behavior, you will see that it has dropped off often precipitously, so much so that many single people, and single men in particular, don't want to get married because now they've developed this cultural expectation that marriage means sex is going to drop off. And that they're better off having an intimate dating relationship, they're better off living with someone, because once they've made that marital commitment and the partner knows that, like, well, now I can no longer easily leave, that the best behavior drops off, and it drops off by a lot. Well, that ought not to be. And that's the whole principle of awesome sex when I'm married as far as expectations go. It's a deal level promise. It's an agreement that this will be a permanent, ongoing part of our relationship unless there's a really good reason, a reason that is compelling enough to be worth violating our vows, because we have mutually agreed that at least for a season, or because of our mutual age, that we agree that this is no longer going to be a part of our relationship at nearly the level it was before, if at all. And that's done by adjusting the deal by collaborative mutual agreement. So, awesome sex when I'm married, create an expectation that the deal just gets better. And by the way, this is one of the keys to getting young single people to be more interested in marital relationships. And when you think about the media representation, who's having sex? Young, hot, and single. And how do we react when we think about our parents having sex? Like, ew, I mean, we recoil from that idea when that should be one of the most beautiful manifestations. That ought to be something that inspires us. And just like with adult parents, very often when you're dealing with your adult children, just the idea of your kids having sex, Oh my gosh, my baby boy, my baby girl, how could they? It's like, well, they're in their late 20s and they're married, of course. And so the way we deal with all these things kind of almost creates this expectation that, well, when you're married, you're not supposed to. But when you're young, hot, and single, totally up for it. And so we need to reverse that. If we want to see a shift in society, we need to reverse that association. We need to create the association in such a way so that the expectation is that this is more a husband and wife thing than it is a young, hot, and single thing. And society and the media is not helping us with this. And so it's up to those of us who are older, more experienced, and especially those of us who are married to create that association, to create that link, to create that connection, to create that insight and understanding that that's what's going on. And then to use the metaphor of there is no space that is embodied in a sexual relationship, to look at other areas of life and think, okay, what is the equivalent of romancing? What is the equivalent of dating? What is the equivalent of this kind of deep connection and affection, and even the sexual connection when it comes to our finances, when it comes to our priorities, when it comes to our home, when it comes to our chosen careers, when it comes to the way we go about things as a couple. And so the more we embody all of these things well, the less divorce is an issue. And one of the big things about divorce, and remember that my whole question on divorce when I was a young Christian began with, what about abuse? And when we get into scripture, some people, they rightly interpret scripture as, well, divorce is for adultery only, or adultery or abandonment by a non-believer only. And that is a very reasonable interpretation. But we have the Ephesians case law that shows that it's not just about adultery. It's about vow breaking. It's about not keeping the deal. And so when we look at everything else in our life, well, what other deals do we have? And how do we shift and adjust the deal? How do we embody how we show up in a way that creates this joint intimacy, this shared experience? And we're looking there at there is no space. And we're looking at keeping the deal. We're looking at making marriage a plus, not a minus. That if there was no commitment, and here's a big way, even when you consider the commitment, is if you knew when you either asked or you were asked that the deal being offered in that moment was the deal you have now, and this obviously applies to couples who've been married for a while, would you have still asked? Would you have still said yes? And craft a now that you would have said yes to. Craft a now that you would have asked for. And that can sometimes be transformational. Now, I haven't talked a whole lot about the man thing yet. I'm planning on doing that starting next time as we approach Father's Day. But hopefully this exploration of, first off, the bump, the how-to, real answers, explain it all. Maybe it doesn't mean what they say. God-trusting, Bible-believing, saved by Jesus church was helpful. Hopefully the discussion on divorce that we've been having for the past few weeks has been helpful. And hopefully then tying back into the original discussions of, the blunt discussions about sex, helps ground the metaphor for what we're talking about. So you begin to see that how the sex and the divorce connect, and how the manifestation of the principles are the same, and that we solve one problem by seeing to the other problem. And that when we start to solve problems, and then we start to look at things like, okay, well, what challenge can we face? And the challenge is something where if we overcome this, if we do this, if we walk through this, we can make something better. So I don't use challenge as just alternative vocabulary to problem, because people don't like the word problem. As a problem is something you solve it or something bad happens. A challenge is something that you do it and something good happens. And as we get ahead of our problems, it allows us to select from the infinite number of available challenges based upon What kind of better do we want to make our life? What kind of better do we want to make our relationships? What kind of better do we want to make our sexual relationship, our financial relationship, our living, our lifestyle, our connection, our intimacy, and the way we walk out our faith in this world with ourselves, with God, and in front of others? So the next time I'm going to be talking about men, I hope that these are kind of helping you understand kind of where I'm going with all of this and what I hope Quest Xian can be about as we build out where all of this is going to be landing at and launching from and all of that. So this is Pastor Scott Conway. Thank you for listening.